When the PlayStation 2 launched in 2000, it looked like another console war was brewing. The Dreamcast was already out, Nintendo had the GameCube coming, Microsoft was about to jump in with the Xbox. 4 consoles, 1 generation. It felt competitive, but this wasn't a fair starting line, because one of these companies had a huge head start. By 2000, Sony had already sold over 100 million original PlayStations worldwide, more than the Nintendo 64 and Sega Saturn combined. That's momentum you don't reset. Retailers trusted the brand, developers had long-term relationships with Sony, players were firmly on board. The 6th generation technically started in 2000, but its power balance was shaped years before. We tend to think of console generations as reset buttons. New hardware, clean slate, may the best system win. That's the story we tell ourselves. But generations don't actually wipe the slate clean. They carry baggage. And sometimes that baggage is 100 million customers. Brand trust carries over. Developer relationships carry over. Consumer habits carry over. An install base isn't just a number, it's power. It influences pre-orders, shelf space, publisher budgets. By the time the PS2 showed up, Sony wasn't walking into an open field. They were walking back onto the home turf of a sold-out stadium already on its feet. Now look at what Sega walked into. The Dreamcast launched in North America on 9/9/99. That date was intentional, obviously. Sega wanted it to feel like an event, and for a moment, it looked like a perfect start. The Dreamcast sold over 500,000 units in its launch window in the US. That's a strong start by any standard. It had an impressive launch lineup. Online play built in, solid early reviews. On paper, it looked like a comeback. But here's the problem. The PlayStation 2 had already been announced, and people were paying attention. And when people know something bigger is around the corner, behavior changes fast. Instead of choosing between Dreamcast and PS2, a lot of people chose to wait. "I'll just wait" might be the most dangerous sentence you hear when you're in the console business. Entire launches have died on that one sentence. Now, to be clear, Dreamcast's uphill battle wasn't only about anticipation. Sega was coming off the 32X and the Saturn, 2 platforms that had weakened consumer confidence in their brand. Financially, the company didn't have infinite runway either. The Dreamcast ultimately sold around 9 to 10 million units worldwide. Now, for comparison, the original PlayStation had already crossed 100 million. That gap represented Sega's instability meeting Sony's momentum. The Dreamcast wasn't just competing with the PlayStation 2, it was competing with what people believed the PlayStation 2 would be. And that was a brutal position to be in. Then Sony added something that changed the conversation: the DVD player. In early 2000, many standalone DVD players were still selling in the $300 to $500 range. The PlayStation 2 launched at $299. So in some cases, it was literally cheaper to buy a PS2 than a DVD player. That changed the buying conversation. For some households, it wasn't, "let's buy a new game console," it was, "we need a DVD player anyway." That sentence sold a lot of PlayStation 2s to parents. When it launched in Japan in March 2000, the PlayStation 2 reportedly sold close to 1 million units within days. Not so much because of the launch titles, which were nothing to write home about, but because it didn't feel like just a gaming purchase. If you only played a handful of games, it still made sense as a media device. The PS2 wasn't just competing with other consoles anymore. It was competing with consumer electronics. The DVD player didn't just add value, it expanded the buyer pool beyond core gamers. Dreamcast was trying to win back gamers. Sony was adding new ones. But consumer demand is only half the story. The other half is developers. Studios don't just follow hype. They follow install base. They follow stability. They follow whatever looks safest long term. The original PlayStation saw over 7,000 games released worldwide. That signals an ecosystem you can trust. Developers already had relationships with Sony. They knew the audience was there. They knew retailers would stock their games. And then the PS2 added backward compatibility, which meant tens of millions of players could carry their PS1 libraries forward. It made switching easier and staying easier. Now again, compare that to the Dreamcast. One of the biggest publishers of the era, Electronic Arts, didn't support it. That means no Madden, no FIFA. They were annual revenue engines. If you're spending 8 figures developing a game, install base matters more than ideal hardware. And while the PS2's architecture was notoriously complex early on, and its launch lineup wasn't dominant, momentum covered that early friction. But this is the type of window challengers need. As former Sega president Peter Moore later said when reflecting on the era, every incumbent needs a challenger to punch them in the face. Well, the Dreamcast swung, but Sony didn't even flinch. By the time the PS2 launched in North America in late 2000, many third-party studios were already planning major releases around it. In January 2001, about 16 months after the Dreamcast launched in North America, Sega announced it was exiting the hardware business. 16 months. That's barely enough time for doubt to disappear, let alone momentum to build. Hardware launches are races against time. You need sales, you need capital stability, you need publishers locked in and fast. Because once doubt sets in, it spreads. The Dreamcast didn't just lose market share, it ran out of runway. Sega's financial position limited how long it could wait for momentum to build. It wasn't crushed overnight, it just couldn't survive long enough to change the ending. In console generations, it's not just about who wins, it's about who can afford to keep fighting. And Sega had already taken too many hits. Let's step back for a second. This wasn't just about Sega. Nintendo didn't try to fight Sony on the same terms. The GameCube skipped DVD playback entirely. It focused on its core audience. Microsoft entered with the Xbox and a long-term strategy. Xbox Live launched in 2002. They weren't trying to win immediately, they were building a foundation. So this wasn't 4 consoles fighting evenly. It was 4 companies entering the same race, but with radically different starting positions. Sega needed urgency. Nintendo needed differentiation. Microsoft just needed a foothold. And Sony? Well, all Sony had to do was build on what already worked. Because once a platform reaches critical mass, the next generation doesn't just start things over. It starts with trust, developer support, and players already on board. The PS2 didn't win because of one feature. It didn't win because it was stronger. It won because by the time it arrived, most of the industry was already moving toward it. The 6th generation felt like a war in the making, but in the end, it was never a fair fight. So I'm interested to hear what you think. If the PlayStation 2 had launched without DVD support, does the outcome change? Or was Sony's momentum already too strong? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and happy gaming, my friends.